terror on Christmas Eve of 2015. I had just started a new job as a psychiatric nurse and had to cover night shifts, including Christmas night, which fell on a Thursday. Technically, it was already Friday by the time I arrived at work. Most of my shifts were calm and uneventful, as I spent a lot of time sitting by the computer, while the majority of the patients slept through the night. Occasionally, I would check on the patients, observe their behavior, or deal with those who became restless during the night. At first, dealing with so many people with mental disabilities was challenging, but the Christmas decorations scattered around the facility brought a little cheer to the place. At night, the main hallway lights would dim, and softer lights would turn on. These dim lights, combined with the Christmas lights hanging throughout the building, created a relaxed and cozy atmosphere. There was one patient in particular who unsettled me. Her name was Louie, an elderly, frail woman with severe schizophrenia. She often muttered unintelligible things to herself and sometimes said things out loud that I assumed were directed at me, though she seemed to only be speaking to herself. Around 3:00 a.m., I went to check on Louie, who had been awake all night. I entered her room and asked if she needed anything. She just stared at me with a horrifying smile and laughed. It gave me chills, like something out of a horror movie. She then looked away and began muttering something I couldn't understand. Most of it was incomprehensible, but the words that stood out were "check the bathroom." I asked her to repeat herself, but she didn't respond. She just turned to her side and rested her head on the pillow, trying to confirm whether she wanted me to check the bathroom. I received no reply, so I decided to check the bathroom inside her room. As expected, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Returning to my desk in the hallway, I glanced at the bathroom door across from my station. My curiosity got the better of me, so I went to check it out. When I tried to turn on the lights, they didn't work. I stood at the doorway, listening for a moment, and then I heard breathing and a clicking sound coming from one of the stalls. I grabbed a doorstop from the desk and placed it under the bathroom door, allowing the light from the hallway to illuminate part of the space. Kneeling down, I peered under the stalls from a distance, but saw no feet in either of them. One of the two stalls was closed. I approached it and peeked through the crack in the door. It was very dark, but I felt like I could see something in the back of the stall. Kneeling again to look under the door, I couldn't see what I thought I saw before. Standing up, I peeked through the crack once more. This time, there was a face staring back at me through the crack. Startled, I almost fell backward but managed to run out, slamming the door shut behind me. Grabbing the key from my desk, I locked the bathroom door and informed another nurse that someone was inside. When we checked together, not only were the lights working again, but both stalls were wide open, and no one was inside either of them. It was impossible for someone to leave the bathroom and lock the door from the inside. Before my shift ended that night, I tried questioning Louie about what was in the bathroom. She didn't respond. As I was about to leave, she said, "Merry Christmas," with that eerie smile again. Something about it felt deeply unsettling. I worked with Louie for a few more weeks before she was transferred to another center for palliative care. To this day, I feel there was a connection between Louis and what I saw in that bathroom. It's one of those stories I just can't explain or rationalize, but that still haunts me. It was Christmas Eve of 2009, and I was 18 years old, working at a small convenience store in the area. Unfortunately, I had the closing shift that night, which meant I'd be alone until midnight. I had thought about quitting because of this, but my parents didn't support the idea. The store was about 4 kilometers from my house, located on a quiet corner of a dead-end street. During the day, the traffic was steady enough to keep the business running, but after 8 p.m., customers were rare. That Christmas Eve, I didn't expect anyone to come after 8 o'clock. My shift started at 4 p.m., and to my surprise, the first few hours were busy. As expected, after 8 p.m., the store emptied out. The pharmacy across from the store closed at 10 o'clock, leaving me completely alone for the next 2 hours. I was upset because the girl who worked at the pharmacy, someone I had a crush on, was leaving. We often chatted when the store was empty, but now I'd be stuck in silence. An hour passed, and I had only served one customer. By 11 p.m., I was eagerly awaiting the end of my shift. Being alone in the store with barely any customers was starting to drive me crazy. Suddenly, I heard a faint noise at the window, like the sound of a zipper brushing against the glass. I looked up and saw a man outside wearing a heavy coat, a hood, loose jeans, and black boots. He was staring at me. After a few seconds of realizing I had noticed him, he walked into the store, passing me without saying a word, and disappeared behind the shelves. About 5 minutes later, I heard a knocking sound coming from one of the aisles. I leaned over to look, but there was no one there. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate, and I knew it was the man causing the noise. Suddenly, I felt an urgent need to use the bathroom, but I couldn't leave the counter unattended with a customer in the store. 10 minutes passed, and I occasionally heard the strange knocking from different areas of the store. I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped away from the counter and called out, "Excuse me." I began searching for the man, but he wasn't anywhere to be found. With each aisle I entered, the sound seemed to come from the next one. In the candy aisle, I heard the sound of sleigh bells on the other side of the shelf, as if someone was shaking them intentionally. I tried peeking through the small gaps in the shelves and saw something completely unexpected and terrifying. A pair of eyes staring back at me. The eyes pulled back, and the tall man entered the aisle where I was. He started making strange noises, like a child or someone who had escaped from an asylum. He began laughing and doing some sort of bizarre dance in my direction. It might have seemed funny, but the scene was deeply unsettling. He moved toward me quickly. I began backing away as he followed me with his strange jumps. I returned to the front of the store, ready to call my manager or the police. When I turned back, I saw him frozen at the end of the first aisle, about 6 meters away from me. His silly, cheerful face transformed into a menacing, malicious expression. I had had enough. I ran out of the store. To my horror, the man began chasing me, not jumping anymore, but running. I ran into the parking lot, too scared to head to my car because I thought he'd decatch me before I could lock the door. I sprinted to the back of the store entering through the back door, which was still unlocked. Not knowing if he was following me, I locked the door and ran to the front of the store, locking the main entrance as well. Then I grabbed the phone from the counter and called my manager, who was still awake. I told him I needed to leave immediately because there was a crazy person after me. As I was explaining, I thought I heard something, the sound of knocking again, but this time coming from inside the store. I left the store and got into my car in 20 seconds without looking back. I called my manager again when I got home, and he called the police. Surprisingly, nothing was stolen. At least, that's what a friend later told me. My manager wasn't happy about the way I left the store that night, and I never spoke to him again. I tried to have as normal a Christmas as possible, considering what had happened the day before. During Christmas Eve of 2012, my family hosted the holiday at our house. At the time, I lived on the top floor of a 2-story house my parents owned. The property was rented out on the lower floor to various tenants over the years. That year, a new tenant had just moved in downstairs, a man in his early 30s who seemed quiet and easygoing. Exactly the type of tenant my parents preferred. Unfortunately, within his first few days living there, strange noises began occurring at night. The front door would open and close multiple times, and there were occasional loud conversations and even shouting. One night, my dad went downstairs to see what was happening and asked him to be quieter. That's when my dad's suspicions about this man started to grow. Fast forward to Christmas Eve, we had the entire family gathered, with the dining table extended and all 20 chairs occupied. My Uncle Jefferson, a heavy smoker, stepped outside multiple times during the night to have a cigarette. After the main course, he went out again, leaving his phone on the table. When the phone began to ring, my dad asked me to take it to him. I grabbed the phone and went downstairs. Before I stepped outside, I noticed that the back door was open. There was a small hallway with 3 doors, one to the downstairs apartment, one leading outside to the front, and one to the backyard. I thought my uncle might be outside, so I headed to the yard to check, but he wasn't there. As I was about to return, I heard movement from the shed. The door was slightly opened. Thinking it was my uncle, I called out to him, but instead, a person stepped out of the shed. It was too dark to see clearly, but I initially assumed it was him. The figure started approaching quickly. At first, I thought he was in a hurry to answer his phone, but as he got closer and the light from the house illuminated his face, I realized it wasn't my uncle. It was the downstairs tenant. There was something intimidating about the way he was moving toward me. So I turned and ran back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I went to the front of the house, where I found my Uncle Jefferson smoking. I stayed by his side and told him about the tenant and how he had practically chased me. My uncle, not one to take things seriously or confront people, brushed it off. I stayed with him until he finished his cigarette. Then we went back upstairs to the dining table. When I told my dad about the tenant in the shed and how he had followed me, the room fell silent. My dad looked concerned, but didn't want to ruin the rest of the dinner, so he waited until the meal was over to check outside. When he returned, he said the tenant hadn't answered his door, but the shed was now locked. A few hours later, after the last relatives had left, my family began preparing for bed. I decided to stay in the living room by the fireplace and the Christmas tree because I loved the warm glow they provided. I put on a Christmas movie and eventually dozed off. I remember waking up suddenly from a light sleep, hearing a creaking sound on the stairs. I was too tired to move and assumed it was my mum, dad, or sister. Our large Christmas tree blocked my view of the stairs, and the carpeted floor muffled any footsteps. Then I heard a door open in the hallway, probably my sister returning to her room. The fire was nearly out, the movie had finished, and the clock read 1:00 a.m. I decided to stay on the couch since I was comfortable. A few minutes later, I heard something near the tree, like an ornament falling. Turning to look, I saw the tree was as still as ever. When I turned back, keeping my eyes open, I saw a man standing over me, slightly leaning forward. My first reaction was to scream. My second was to analyze his face. It wasn't my dad. It was the tenant from downstairs. I screamed even louder. The man tried to cover my mouth, but it was too late. My family heard me. He bolted up the stairs just as my dad came out of his room. My dad chased him, but he managed to get into his car and drive away. I think he was checking if I was asleep before trying to steal something, or worse. Fortunately, my parents had copies of his ID and other information, which they used to locate and press charges against him. We easily won the case for home invasion, but the experience remains one of the most terrifying of my life. It was last Christmas Eve, and I had been working late. I was 23 years old, living in Switzerland, and I commuted daily by train to and from work. Being one of the youngest employees in the office, I ended up with one of the least desirable shifts and only managed to leave work at 5:00 p.m. My family had already left an hour earlier to go to my cousin's house for Christmas dinner, so I had to travel alone. After grabbing a quick snack, I got in my car and put my cousin's address into the GPS. Midway through the drive, it began to snow heavily. By the time I arrived at my cousin's house, around 6 p.m., there was already a thin layer of snow covering the ground. The dinner was lovely. I brought gifts, greeted everyone cheerfully, and enjoyed the festive atmosphere. I stayed until around 11:00 p.m. The rest of my family had left a bit earlier, but I decided to stick around for another half hour to chat. When I finally left, the snow had accumulated to about 60 centimeters, and it was still falling heavily. The drive home was treacherous. The roads were barely cleared, and I had to drive at less than 30 kilometers per hour for most of the way. The streets were eerily deserted, probably because most people had been smart enough to stay home as the snow piled up. Eventually, I turned onto a main road that would normally be bustling with activity. However, at 11:15 p.m., on Christmas Eve, there wasn't a single car or shop light to be seen. The entire area felt like a ghost town. That's when I noticed the flashing taillights of a car parked on the side of the road. Smoke was rising from its exhaust, and the red glow of its taillights pierced through the white haze of the snowfall. As I got closer, I saw someone standing next to the car, waving. I thought they might be in trouble and needed help. Feeling like a good Samaritan, I decided to pull over behind the car. Before I could even get out, the man approached my car quickly. He was of average height, about 1.7 meters tall, and stocky, wearing a thick coat. His voice was sharp and demanding as he asked, "Do you know anything about fixing engines?" I replied honestly, saying I didn't know much about cars. Without missing a beat, he told me to wait and open the trunk of his car. I stayed in my car, confused about what he wanted. He walked to the front of his car and opened the hood. I couldn't see what he was doing because the trunk was blocking my view, and the sound of the strong wind and snow muffled any noise. I leaned against the back of his car, waiting, when suddenly I heard 3 or 4 quick, heavy steps crunching in the snow behind me. Before I could react, I was shoved hard into the open trunk. The man tried to slam the trunk shut, but I resisted, kicking and bracing my feet against the edges. I managed to push him away and open the trunk completely. Taking advantage of those few seconds, I grabbed my house keys. When he lunged at me again, I drove one of the keys into his neck. He fell to his knees, screaming, his cries echoing through the empty street. I scrambled into my car and sped off, not even bothering to close my door fully. A few minutes later, I called the police and reported the incident. I returned to the scene about 10 minutes later to find the area lit up by the flashing red and blue lights of police cars reflecting off the snow and the storefront windows. The police had detained the man who was being treated by paramedics. I stayed long enough to give a statement and watched as they loaded him into an ambulance. I arrived home safely about half an hour later, deeply shaken. I recounted the terrifying ordeal to my family, who were equally horrified. That Christmas remains one of the most horrifying experiences of my life, a memory that still makes me shudder to this day. A few years ago, on Christmas Eve, I was living alone in a rented house. That evening, I spent time with my family and only managed to get home late at night. I was exhausted. My sleep schedule was all over the place, and I'd had an incredibly stressful work week. All I wanted to do was collapse into bed and sleep. Normally, I would take a shower when I got home, and then head straight to bed to watch Netflix or YouTube. But that night, I was so tired. I went straight to sleep after checking my phone for a few minutes. I needed to wake up early the next morning. It was Christmas, after all. I think I fell asleep around 8:00 p.m. But it couldn't have been long before I woke up to the sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. To give you some context, my bedroom was in the basement. I'm a light sleeper, so the noise startled me awake. As I lay there, I quickly realized that someone had broken into my house. My first instinct was to call the police, but my phone had no signal. Sometimes the signal in the basement was terrible, and that was one of those nights. I rushed to the laundry room, which was also in the basement, and grabbed a 30 centimeters steel pipe I had there for emergencies. I didn't want to use it, but I needed to be prepared. I hid behind some hanging clothes in the laundry room. Not the best hiding spot, but it was all I had. I tried calling the police several times, but the calls wouldn't go through due to the lack of signal. Frustrated, I let my fear turn into anger. The noises upstairs continued and got louder, as if someone was banging on things. Then everything went quiet for a few minutes. That's when I heard someone trying to open the basement door. I think I had locked it because they couldn't get it open. I always had a habit of checking if the doors were locked, and I'm grateful for that. It might have saved my life. The intruder began shouting and banging on the door, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. They started kicking the door, trying to break it down, but it held. I sat there, waiting for what felt like forever, hoping they would give up and leave. Eventually, the noise stopped. I waited in silence for what felt like hours before I finally gathered the courage to go upstairs and check the house. I was ready for the intruder to jump out at me at any moment, ready to fight for my life, but they were gone. The only thing they left behind was a note taped to my refrigerator. It read, "I'll be back," and it was filled with smiley faces. I didn't take the threat too seriously, but still called the police to report what had happened. I didn't have any information about the intruder, not what they looked like, not their age, nothing that could help. The police couldn't do much except reassure me that I would be fine and that they'd catch the person eventually. To this day, it still haunts me because I don't know how they got in. There were no signs of forced entry. The following year, on Christmas Eve, I was at my girlfriend's house when I got a notification from my doorbell camera app. It said someone was at my front door. When I checked the footage, I saw a man on my porch trying to get my attention or break in. I'm sure it was the same man from the year before. He looked confused by the camera. I shouted through the intercom that the police were on their way and that he'd be arrested if he didn't leave. It worked. He ran off, and I haven't seen or heard from him since. I called the police and gave them the description, but by the time they arrived, he was long gone. Now, every Christmas, I feel paranoid, wondering if he'll come back. I'm moving in 3 months, hoping I can finally feel safe in my own home again.